So SCV Water, who we are, we're a full service regional water agency located in the Santa Clarita Valley. We provide water to over 273,000 people. We're currently in a drought. We have initiated stage 1 of our water shortage contingency plan. If you're interested in learning more about that, please visit droughtreadyscv.com and save as much water as possible. Together we can save 15%. And if you're interested in some rebate programs, visit conserve.yourscvwater.com, where we have rebates for residential, commercial, and irrigation rebates. And we're currently offering a Water Smart workshop to all our customers. You can receive a $20 credit on your water bill for completing the workshop. Shouldn't take more than an hour, where Wendy Waters will walk you through, and you can conduct your own water survey throughout your home, and it'll help you learn new things to save water. We also have some other landscape resources, some self-guided tours, steps to replacing your lawn, water guide, watering device types, and then common irrigation challenges. So I recommend you visit our website. And if you don't already, please connect with us. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or watch some of our videos on YouTube. So now I'm going to hand it over to John Windsor. He is going to be conducting today's presentation.
Okay, welcome folks. So this is a very large topic we're going to talk about, trees and shrubs that you can grow here in the Santa Clarita Valley. So we're going to start with trees, and trees, of course, are the biggest part of the landscaping, and so they are the most important decision you can make regarding landscaping. A good decision when first choosing a tree will go a long way towards saving you headaches down the road. For instance, you should know the full size of the tree and its full spread before you plant it. For instance, on this European olive here, well, that will easily get 25 to 30 feet high and wide. So if you put that next or 5 feet away from a block wall or 5 feet away from your house, you can see that within a very short period of time, it's going to be pushing into the wall, going over the wall, or pushing into the house. So giving the trees the proper space is very important. Now, regarding the olive tree itself, you may want to choose one that doesn't produce fruit unless you're willing to go out there and pick up the fruit and make olives from it. It's quite a bit of work, and most people don't do that. So if they have a fruiting olive, they typically will spray the tree to prevent fruit. But the tree will grow anywhere, and it's very drought tolerant. These are some varieties that are available. The little ollie is a shrub, very nice looking shrub, small, neat, compact. Swan Hill and other varieties like it produce no fruit, but you still get the beautiful olive tree and its structure and everything. And then some varieties produce just a small amount of fruit after a number of years. Next is the crepe myrtle, and you're probably very familiar with that. They grow everywhere here in the Santa Clarita Valley, particularly in the hottest, sunniest, driest locations. So it's a beautiful tree, many different flowers. What they don't like is to be planted in the middle of a lawn or any place that you're going to be irrigating a lot. But on this slide, you can see it's right out in the open in the full sun, and it thrives. It will take as much heat as you can give it. If it's near the coast or in a confined area, maybe next to a wall or a house, you may get some powdery mildew on it. There are different varieties. The one you're looking here on this screen is a multi-trunk. This one looks like a single trunk for a few feet. And they come either way. And they've got beautiful flowers in many different colors. Whites, pinks, reds, and corals. Very dependable in hot, sunny locations. Needs very little care, very little pruning after the flowers finish. You can prune off, deadhead the tree, and it'll look great. And here's a tree that everybody's familiar with, the coast live oak. These are protected trees. That means you can't take them out or prune them without getting a permit from the city. These are natives, so they've been here long before we were. And a couple things to know about these trees. Because they are natives, they basically go to sleep in the summer when it's hot and we don't receive any rain. That would be the time to prune the tree when it's asleep. So this is the exception to the rule as far as pruning. This tree gets pruned in the summer. Now they are susceptible to many insects and diseases, but the diseases are all caused by excessive watering. Because they are a native tree, they're used to getting all of the water between October and March, nothing in the summer. So quite often watering them in the summer is not a great thing. Okay, don't change the grade or disturb the roots. They're used to growing by themselves, and they do best with very little interference from humans. Keep water off the base of the trunk. So this particular slide shows a tree that's not doing too well. And the reason for that is because it's in a cemetery and it does get watered a lot more than the tree likes. It does produce acorns, which may or may not be a nuisance to some people. There's another variety of oak tree, the cork oak. It is not protected, so this one you can prune or remove if you so desire. It's an interesting tree in that its dormant period, because it comes from the Mediterranean region, its dormant period seems to be in spring, and it'll drop a lot of leaves in the spring, and that can be a little unnerving. And yes, this is where they actually get cork from this tree. Very tough tree. Most plants that come from the Mediterranean region do quite well in our region. And you can see the leaves look a lot like an oak tree. It's really the trunk that is spectacular. Here's a tree that's being used a lot now in Santa Clarita because it does have a bit of a weeping effect, and most weeping trees don't perform well or have serious problems. For instance, the weeping willow is a terrible tree to attempt to grow out here. It has aggressive surface roots, has branches that break, it's got insect issues, a lot of issues with weeping trees. The California pepper is another one that has a lot of problems, a lot of issues. And so if you like that look, this would be the tree for you. It comes from Australia, very drought tolerant, does not have any of the disadvantages that I just mentioned of other willows. Requires very little, if any, pruning, and No known pests at this point. So the city is using these now as street trees because they are very effective at that and have very little maintenance issues. It's another tree that we see a lot of here. It's a native. It's the California sycamore. Now, a lot of people believe that it's called a sycamore because it's sick more than it is healthy. And that's pretty accurate. They have a lot of problems. They have a disease called anthracnose that they will get if we get a wet spring. So while a wet spring is great for everything, great for the wildflowers, great for our gardens, a sycamore doesn't like that. They're also prone to powdery mildew, different types of insects. And once again, this is a plant that grows quite large. Look at the size of that. So that's not a plant to plant in a small front yard, or really, unless you have a very big yard, probably not one I would recommend. There are other varieties of sycamore that don't have as many pest problems. The occidentalis, the London plane tree, which you'll see up and down Orchard Village Parkway there on Orchard Village. Those are those white trunk trees you see. Those are a type of sycamore called the London plane tree. They don't have nearly the problems of the California. Now here's another tree you may see up and down McBean Boulevard, the Chinese flame tree. Once again, gets quite large, but slow to get there. So trimming can keep this in bounds. I've seen people maintain this tree at 25 to 35 feet. Does get some yellow blooms in August. So it blooms much later than other flowering plants. Good street tree because it does not have an aggressive root system. The bipinata is another variety of Coleruteria. And we also see this in the Santa Clarita Valley. It takes the heat and the drought and everything quite well. Now here's a tree we don't see much of out here, the ginkgos. But they're actually great trees. They're wonderful trees, mostly upright, so fairly narrow, and relatively slow growing. And as you can see here, not too bad as a street tree or in a parkway. And one of the best trees to get some fall foliage. So if you want some color in your yard in the fall, as you know, here in Southern California, we don't get that like they do back east, but certainly this would be a good one to plant. And a very attractive tree. Leaves are unlike any other tree because this is a very old tree. They found fossils of this from tens of thousands of years ago. So this may be one of the oldest trees that we have on record. So we go from the oldest tree, the ginkgo, to the messiest tree on earth, the albizia or silk tree. This tree is very interesting because it can find a way to produce litter every day of the year and every season. This tree can drop leaves, it can drop flowers, it can drop whole twigs, and it can drop seed pods. So where this tree is really great is in a neighbor's yard down below you, so that you can look down and see the pink flowers that are very pretty. But if it's in your own yard, you may not see the flowers that well, other than when you're raking them up. Okay, grows quite easily here. takes the drought and the heat quite well, and does not need to be watered very frequently at all. There's a picture of the flower, and there are some different varieties, but as a rule, mostly pink, and as you can see, some of them are more resistant to certain diseases. None of them are resistant to making a mess, though. The Chinese pistache, that's a beautiful tree. Once again, spectacular fall color. So drought tolerant, takes the sun, takes the heat. This is a beautiful tree, 30 to 40 feet. So it's a nice sized tree. It'd be a great shade tree in a front yard or a backyard. And there you see a picture of the fall foliage, which can be yellow, orange, or red. Now, it is related to, but the Chinese pistache is not the pistachio tree. That is the Pistacia vera, which is a fruit-producing species and can be grown here. I've actually known people that have grown pistachio trees here with success because they love the heat. They love the heat. Here's a tree that's not used very much, but it's a very pretty tree, the Chinese fringe tree. It's a smaller tree. So you may have room for that in your tree. It's got beautiful white flowers. Can be grown as a multi-trunk shrub or as a small tree. Here's a picture of it in bloom. As you can see, it's very nice. Okay, so it's a great street tree or in a small residential yard. There's a close-up of the flowers. Next here we have one of the various types of locusts. And the locust, most of them are native to the central United States, all the way from the Great Plains across the Mississippi. And it's an interesting tree in that it grows kind of funny. Here it's called erratic maverick branches. The interesting thing about this tree is it's one of the last trees to leaf out. So quite often I hear people saying that they think their tree is dead because all the other trees in the yard have leaves, but not this one. The newer varieties of honey locust, they don't have thorns that the old ones used to. They do have quite the root system though. Performs best in areas of hot summers and cold winters. Takes the heat, the drought, doesn't care what kind of soil. There's a close-up of the yellow foliage, which once again puts some people off. In other words, they see yellow on a plant or a tree and they think it's perhaps ill. Now we're going to talk about a few palms. The few palms we're going to talk about are palms that grow here quite well, and you see around quite a lot. Now, the first one is this windmill palm. It's a smaller palm, grows very slowly. Okay, never going to grow you out of house or home. It's got a single trunk, and it's a very nice palm. There's a row of them because you can put several of them in a rather small area. So they're effective as a street tree or just about anywhere. And they are hardy to about 10 degrees, meaning the cold weather that may affect some of the other palms we're going to talk about won't affect this one. And like with most palms, after a number of years, it will produce a fruit. Now here's a very pretty one, the Mediterranean fan palm. Usually it grows in clumps. Very slow growing. Beautiful in a setting like that. And also will grow in a container for years. Okay, sometimes grown as a hedge, one of the easiest plants to transplant. And once again, will take cold weather quite well and does not care too much about the soil. You can see just how compact these are and how they send up new shoots from the bottom. So rather pretty. And then here's one that everybody's familiar with, the queen palm. In the 80s and 90s, these were very popular and people were planting them everywhere. And slowed down quite a bit on doing that once they found out about the fruit. Because after 10 or 15 years, they do produce a fruit that makes quite a mess, and you'll have to get a trimmer up there every year to prune out the flowers to prevent the hazard from the fruiting. There's a picture of the flower before the fruit. And there's a picture of it with the fruit hanging and some limbs hanging down. And then the sago palm. They're not a true palm at all. They're once again one of these ancient plants belonging to the cycad family. Once again, these were much more popular 20, 30 years ago. But people found that they do grow. They can grow up to 10 feet tall and 10 feet across. So quite often, if they were planted as little trees near a sidewalk or driveway or walkway, you can't prune them. So a lot of people have had to take them out once they get mature. If they're in an area where size isn't a problem, then they're fine. They tend to perform better without the hot afternoon sun. So underneath other trees and shrubs, they tend to do quite well. But a south-facing slope or a south side of your house in Santa Clarita, they may burn up. And they do well in containers for a number of years. The evergreen pear, another very popular tree here. It's one of the first plants to bloom, sometimes as early as January, typically in February. Relatively small tree with a small root system. I think that's why it's so popular, is because of the small root system. However, very susceptible to fire blight, which is a disease that, well, it's a real problem. So I just cannot recommend this tree at all, because the fire blight is here in the Santa Clarita Valley. And to plant a tree like this, you're almost certain to get the disease. Another variety, the Bradford pear, is more upright, and it does get some nice coloring in the fall. And also the white flowers is thought to be less susceptible to the fire blight. And the some of the newer varieties will give you some different color and hopefully some more resistance to fire blight. And the Carolina cherry. This is probably more of a shrub for most of its life. Upright, fairly narrow. In maturity, get quite big, and I have seen some here in Santa Clarita that were 15 to 20 feet tall. They get small white flowers and a fruit. There you see it as a hedge, and that's quite often what it's used for. It does not have an aggressive root system. That's great. Can take drought, but should probably not be watered more than once a week. Once a week in the summer is fine. Overwatering will give you some real issues. In fact, you can kill them with too much water. There are a couple of compact varieties that make a nice lower hedge from 6 to 8 feet, and very attractive foliage. Then we get to the magnolias. Now, the regular magnolia, the one that we know from the southeastern United States, down in Georgia, that's a big tree, very big tree, not suitable for most of the yards in Santa Clarita Valley. It does start out slow, and so some people buy little trees, and for the first 5 years or so, it's fine. But can you imagine a 40 to 60 foot tall and wide tree in your yard? The flowers are pretty. The tree does drop a lot of leaves, almost constant and heavy in the springtime, which can be a nuisance. One advantage it has is it will grow in your lawn because it can't take the extra moisture that we give lawns. But it'll also tolerate drought. So good lawn tree if you have a great big lawn and you don't mind raking up the leaves every single week. Now there are some varieties that are much smaller and they're very pretty. The St. Mary's, small variety, with small white flowers, very good for compact areas, very neat tree. The little gem has very attractive foliage and is very small. So for those that want a magnolia but can't take the size, any of the first two would be nice. Majestic Beauty is the big guy. You may want to avoid that one. And then we get to the purple leaf plum. You see these trees around. About the only tree that has purple foliage, and it was hybridized for that. It's not a natural plant. It was, in fact, hybridized for this, for the purple coloration on the leaf. But unfortunately, it's one of the shortest lived trees that I'm aware of. Very short lifespan, and that has to do with the breeding. If you're aware of dog breeds, you'll probably know that when they breed a dog to look a little unusual, that dog usually has a very short life. Same with this particular tree. One sign that it's on its way out is that it will produce fruit, an edible fruit. Quite often people say, hey, my tree's begun to produce fruit. Is it poisonous? No, it's actually plum. Takes extreme temperatures. It does get a disease as it matures, and it gets borers, which is an insect. So very fine tree for a small period of time. Does not have a terribly aggressive root system, so you can grow it as a patio tree or in small areas. And there it is in bloom. So you get the white flowers in spring, and then you get the purple leaves in the summer. We're going to see some pine trees. This is the Italian stone pine, one of the bigger pine trees. You'll find these in parks, like over at Newhall Park. I think they've got a couple of great big ones over there. And not a tree for your yard, though. It's one of the few trees, though, that has a wide top to it and a trunk. So you can actually, if need to be, you could work around it, you could mow around it, etc. But it becomes a very large tree, doesn't care about soil, and very strong, very tough. And here's the Elderica, one of the better trees for Southern California, because it has all the advantages of a pine tree in that it's drought tolerant, takes the sun, takes the heat, but it's much more adaptable because it will tolerate alkaline soils, etc. The deer and the rabbits won't eat it. So it's sometimes called the Afghan pine. So if you absolutely had to have a pine tree for whatever reason, that would probably be a better one than some of the others. All pines, of course, are a fire hazard, so keep that in mind. The Canary Island pine, you see a lot of these around. Quite tall but narrow, and The new growth is an attractive blue that eventually turns into very long green needle, which fall almost constantly. So keep that in mind. While it is very tough and very durable and will grow almost anywhere, like any pine, it produces copious amounts of needles. And some years, the litter is outrageous. This is an evergreen native tree. The incense cedar grows up in our foothills all the way to the higher elevations. I've seen them up in Yosemite. Obviously, it tolerates any type of soil, water, just about anything. Narrow and upright. Does not seem to have any of the problems that pines have. So for somebody that wanted an evergreen, the incense cedar might just be a great plant for them. It is slow growing, got the beautiful dark red fissured bark. And because it is a cedar, it does deter lots of different insects. And that's a typical form for one right there. Here's the giant sequoia. I don't think we really have much room in our yards for these, but they're beautiful trees. Of course, this is the one that grows in the sequoias. Slower growing, might be fun for a few years. Takes the heat really well, and will take lawn watering. They have developed some varieties. This pendula is a weeping variety, and the glaucum has bluish green foliage. And here's the Italian cypress. Used to be widely used for this form that it has here as a screen, etc. Was planted quite heavily in the 50s and 60s. Nowadays here in Santa Clarita, I don't think you'll find one that's less than 20 years old. People just don't plant them anymore. But they are tough. Boy, they're tough. Grow in any type of soil, take the heat, need very little water. And they have now developed some dwarf ones, which will make a good screen, and some that are narrow, one with gold form. So maybe these dwarf varieties might be better for what we eventually want to use them for anyway. Then the deodar cedar, beautiful tree. It does need space. It's just too large for residential, but it's a beautiful, tough tree, very strong. A couple of very mature ones over at Hart Park. Got a beautiful trunk. The branches can be trained up so that you can work underneath it. Does have a large root system, so you can't really plant underneath it at all. And they have developed some newer varieties that don't get quite as tall, including some that are very short, kind of fun little plants. And then the Atlas cedar. This is a beautiful plant, not too terribly big. I don't see too many that have reached full maturity here. But it does have the beautiful blue foliage, quite the nice looking tree for an evergreen, very nice. And it's quite often trimmed or bonsai'd. Takes any type of soil and temperatures. It can take irrigation to drought, and there are some different varieties, but the blue foliage ones of the glauca are very, very pretty. Very pretty trees. Thujas. These were grown once again a lot in the 50s and 60s. Then they kind of slowed down, and now people are planting them again. And here you see some Italian cypress behind them. So people are planting these instead of the old Italian cypress because they realize they just don't need a tree 40 feet tall to block out a neighbor. They found they can do that with a tree that only gets 12 to 15 foot tall. And there's a hedge of them, and very tough. They take the heat quite well, and we don't get cold enough here to bother them at all. And some of them give you some different looking foliage. Most are green, but there are some yellow varieties. Okay, now we're getting into the trees known as the redbuds. And the redbuds are beautiful trees. There are different varieties. Some species are native to here, to California. They're up in the foothills. Some come from the eastern United States. One we'll talk about comes from Oklahoma. There's a variety that comes from Mexico. So they come from hot, dry locations. They all have beautiful flowers, mostly red, and are just very durable. And some can be grown as a single trunk or multi-trunk tree. This particular variety, the forest pansy, is one of the smaller, actually. I'm not even sure that this is a picture of the forest pansy itself, but it has a great big heart-shaped leaf. It needs some protection. So it's what they call an understory tree. In other words, it grew under other types of trees, perhaps oaks or other trees that you might find up in the Sierras. So it doesn't do real well when it's exposed to real hot, sunny, windy locations. But if you have a good location for it, this is one of the prettiest trees in nature. Aside from just its beautiful pink flowers, the new foliage in the spring comes out purplish. So you get a beautiful heart-shaped flower, purplish in the spring, and then beautiful flowers. So reddish pink flowers and deep purple foliage on the forest pansy. The Oklahoma redbud has deep red flowers, and that is a beautiful, beautiful tree. Typically 20 to 25 feet tall and wide, slow growing, beautiful shiny leaves. The alba gives you white flowers, and then the occidentalis is the native. That is a shrub. It's really a shrub, multi-trunked, obviously takes any kind of weather conditions we can throw at it, and the pink flowers in early spring. Also, when these plants go dormant, the trunks are very dark. So they're very interesting plants all year round. Dark stems, pinkish red flowers, and heart-shaped leaves give it a year-round attention. Here's a tree that is a hybrid, that a natural hybrid. It comes from the Desert Museum in Tucson, Arizona, where they had planted several different species of Parkinsonia and Palo Verdes. And those trees, the pollen intermingled and came up with this hybrid that captured all of the good variety, all of the good instincts of these trees and put it all into one tree. And that Palo Verde has the green trunk, thorns, no thorns. The native Palo Verdes have thorns. This one does not have any thorns, and it blooms for a much longer period of time. This is an excellent tree. In fact, often when rating trees, this is rated as the #1 tree available, period. Beautiful yellow flowers, small wispy leaves, a green trunk, and no issues at this point. In other words, no insect or disease problems. There are some varieties that are a little different, but the Desert Museum seems to be the king of the the Palo Verde family. Pretty fast growing too. It is a fast grower. And there you can see it growing in a drought tolerant garden where it needs very little, if any, water, but does grow a little faster if you do water it occasionally. So the Desert Museum does have the yellow flowering, the green trunk, and takes the heat. There's a close-up of the flower, just a beautiful plant. Another plant that has been hybridized is the mesquite. There are different varieties. So if you're going to plant a mesquite, get one of the newer varieties that is thornless. There are native varieties of mesquites that grow out in the desert. So obviously they're very tough. But those varieties, the native varieties, tend to have thorns. There's a variety that was developed at the same time that the Desert Museum Palo Verde was, that is completely thornless and upright, grows very quickly. Prefers well-drained soil, grow with little or no water, but if you do water it, it will grow faster and quicker than you might think. It's a picture of the thornless varieties. They do get a little flower and a little fruit on them, but it's not necessarily a nuisance fruit. And then the Raywood ash. This is probably the only variety of ash that I would recommend in Santa Clarita because it is a smaller variety. It's a very pretty variety. Narrow in youth, does not have the extensive root system as other varieties of ash tree. Got nice little small leaves, can be used in parking lots or on as a street tree because of the relatively small root system. Aphids are an occasional problem. And there we go. Yes, one of the few plants, once again, that will give you some beautiful color in the fall. It's another variety of ash that we don't see it too much anymore because this is the reason why. Do you see that tiny little house dwarfed by the gigantic tree? Well, that's what happens. These trees are huge with roots that will extend 1.5 times beyond the drip line. So the neighbors on both sides are dealing with the roots from this tree. I don't think there's anybody in Santa Clarita that wants a tree 80 feet tall and 80 feet across. Notorious for surface roots, so it breaks sidewalks, streets, and driveways constantly. The Arizona ash, a little smaller, used previously as a street tree or shade tree, but not so much anymore because of all of the disease problems, the insect problems, problems with the roots. There's just no reason to plant this tree, and I don't know why anybody would. Surface roots. The Modesto ash used to be planted a lot more because it got some yellow coloring in the spring, but once again, good tree to avoid. Now here's a good tree to plant, the arbutus. There are different varieties of arbutus. The Marina is typically sold as a tree. Very beautiful trunk. The trunk and bark look like the madrone of Northern California, but it comes from the Mediterranean region. It's a beautiful tree. As you can see, it does not have aggressive roots, so it can be grown in areas like this. Has that beautiful reddish bark. So one of the better trees that you could plant It does produce a fruit, which is edible, but well, I don't know anybody that really enjoys eating it, but you can eat it. They're using it a lot now as street trees and in medians and parking lots because it does not have a terribly aggressive root system. And there's the fruit, which is not messy. And as I mentioned, it is edible. Here's a native, the toyon, or called the Christmas holly. Hollywood, the town, was actually named after this because of all the holly plants that grew in the hills around Hollywood. Yep, that's where it got its name. And it does produce berries, very tough, obviously, if it's a native. It will grow into a large bush, needs very little care at all. Great on a slope because its root system holds the slope in. It's green all year. Takes anything you want to throw at it. And there's the little berries that it produces. And here's a tree that comes from Africa that is tough as nails. They grow it out in the desert a lot because you not only can't kill it, I'm not sure you can ever get rid of it. It's a tree that when you cut it down, it tends to send up more suckers. But pretty good for small areas. Does take the heat really well, really well. It doesn't care about the soil. If it's watered excessively, it could be susceptible to a root rot. A nice pointed leaf. The Laurus nobilis, or the laurel tree. This is a small plant. Not planted as much anymore, but it's slow growing, can be grown as a shrub, can be grown in a pot. And this is the plant from which the bay leaf comes that you use in cooking. And here's a little tip, try some small branches with leaves in the barbecue. It does bear some little flowers and fruits, and it can be maintained at a very small size. You could even grow it in a pot for quite some time. And there are some newer varieties that are more resistant to some of the bugs. Now, for anybody that would ever even dream about planting a eucalyptus, hopefully you get rid of that dream right away, and then plant this tree instead. It comes from Australia. It looks a lot like eucalyptus, but does not have the issues. It's got a beautiful bark. It takes the sun and the heat, and it's more upright and not quite as big as most eucalyptus plants, and does not have the aggressive root system of most eucalyptus plants. Got the beautiful trunk, though, and can be used as a street tree or any area that you may have once thought that you wanted a eucalyptus. It's got pretty leaves, and like I say, this is for folks that think, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a eucalyptus? Plant this instead. And we'll go down here to the Eriobatria. This is the bronze loquat. Can be trained up into a small tree, but typically it gets wider than it does high. It has a native that we'll talk about in a minute that produces fruit. This one does not produce fruit, but it does have a coppery leaf to it. So kind of an attractive foliage and no fruit. And then we get to the japonica, which is the one that does produce fruit and loves the sun, loves the heat, and the fruit is edible and delicious, actually. And it does produce a pretty flower. Big leathery leaves. Seems to be just very durable. I've seen this grow everywhere from the desert to the coast. There's the fruit. And you can just pick them right off the tree and eat them. They do have seeds. but not a real issue. Fruit's attractive to birds and to me. There you go. There's a close-up of the fruit and the seeds. The majestic beauty is a small tree or shrub, and it's a cross between the loquat that we just talked about and the Raphaeolippus. Pretty pink flowers and a small root system, which might make it good in parking lots or smaller areas. It does get the flowers of Raphaeolippus and a big thick leaf, kind of a nice tree, small, so it won't grow you out of house and home. Now we get into some of the other varieties of locust. There are two major varieties. One has pink and one has white flowers. And the purple one, all of them are grafted onto the locust root system, which can be an issue. It can produce suckers, and those suckers will have thorns. So you may want to think twice about planting a locust. The purple robe, I've seen that around. It's got very showy flowers, very pretty purple flowers. But once again, be aware that if anything suckers from the ground underneath the plant, it will revert back to having the thorns. Melaleucas, these were popular in coastal areas, clear into the Hollywood area, and perhaps even the San Fernando Valley. We don't see them as much out here, and it might be because in the past we had gotten cold winters, and cold winters can be rough on these guys. So we don't see them nearly as much as you will if you travel south a bit. The Catalpa, here's an interesting tree. It's a hybrid between the Chalopsis, which is our native, and the Catalpa, which is an eastern tree. So it gets the toughness of our native, but the bigger flowers of the Catalpa. Does not like to be overwatered, and if it's not out in an open area, it can get powdery mildew. The Pink Dawn is the most popular, very pretty flowers. And here's a native, the desert willow. This is a beautiful tree, tough as nails, obviously coming from the desert, fast growing, gets beautiful flowers that look like little orchids. The flower can vary. There are some varieties that will be true to the name. I believe the burgundy here is one of the prettiest and is not quite as messy as far as the pods hanging on the tree. The native, this is the native up here. The pods hang on for quite a while. Some of the new hybridized varieties, the pods tend to fall off sooner. Very tough, very small tree, excellent tree. Now we're going to get into just a few shrubs. The Abelia, it's a plant that once again isn't planted quite as much anymore. It comes in two different varieties that are seen around, the pinks and the whites, typically 4 feet to 6 feet. Some varieties only about 3 feet. The Edward Goucher is the one with the pink flowers and very easy to maintain. Berberis, once again, not grown as much as it used to be. This is probably the reason right here, the thorns. Most people, myself included, don't really like thorns. But if you wanted to make an excellent barrier to keep things out, this might work. And it does give you the purple foliage, mostly in the fall. And here's the boxwood. Everybody should be familiar with that plant. Typically grown just like this, as a small hedge that can be kept anywhere from 2 feet to perhaps 6 feet with shearing. Got the pretty green leaf. And there are newer varieties with different colored foliage. Now here's a beautiful plant that produces wonderful flowers. There's a variety of it with red flowers. It's often called the Costco flower because it grows in the Costco parking lot. Very tough, very durable. Takes little or no water, little or no pruning, and loves the heat, loves the sun. Just a wonderful, wonderful plant. The bottle brush, once again, not planted quite so much anymore, but it's not a bad tree. It's relatively small, has a pretty flower, thrives on neglect, takes the heat, smog, everything. And there are some newer varieties. The Little John you'll see in the medians now in the streets as little bushes, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, but still get the red flowers on it. Pretty little shrub, and you'll see it around the lot in Santa Clarita. Now, camellias, here's a plant that wants the shadiest spot in your yard and needs to be planted in an acidic type soil, which we don't have. So our native soil is not good for it. It does need to be amended with a lot of peat moss. It needs to be fed with acid type foods and watered when it's young. But here's where it needs to be, underneath the shade of other trees. And there are 100 varieties, beautiful, beautiful flowers. The variety Sasanqua is a shrubbier type. Sometimes spreads wider than it does high and takes a little bit more heat, takes a little more sun than the japonica, but I would still plant it on the east or the north side of the house. Very, very pretty, very pretty foliage and flowers. Once again, only about 20% of your native soil. The rest has to be amended with peat and soil amendments. But you can even grow them in hanging baskets, pots, etc. The Yuletide is one that blooms obviously around Christmas time. Very pretty variety. Here's another hardy plant, good for a slope. Those hot, dry slopes where you want to have good erosion control. The rock rose. This is a plant for that. It's a small plant, 3 to 6 feet high and wide. Comes in different color flowers, white, pink, red, lavenders. Can just be planted on a slope and then just let it go. And it'll bloom every spring and you won't have to do much to it. It's another good one for the slope. The cotoneaster produces red berries that the birds like, crawls along the ground, so hugs the ground. Just very good on a slope for erosion control. Good in mass plantings. Takes dry soil, very little maintenance. There are a bunch of different varieties. Some with different flowers, maybe some pink flowers, some with different, maybe bigger berries. Now the silverberry, not planted so much anymore, but just a tough shrub, comes from China. Takes the heat and the sun really well. Known for having the ability to grow almost anywhere and different varieties. It's called the silverberry because of the different variegations on the leaf, and it will actually, after some years, produce a tiny little fruit that is not a mess at all. Escallonia, an evergreen shrub with some purplish flowers, usually seen at about maximum 5 feet high and 5 feet wide, and gets some pinkish flowers on it. Does prefer well-drained soil, doesn't like the clay soil, and it doesn't like to be watered terribly often. Some of the newer varieties have smaller leaves, smaller flowers, more compact, and very attractive. Euonymus, here's another plant that just loves the sun, loves the heat. In fact, don't plant it anywhere near any shade. It needs to be out in the open where it can just bake in the sun. There are dozens of varieties from all green to gold to white and green, excellent as a hedge or background plant, and just give it as much sun and heat and very little water. The pineapple guava, here's a very attractive shrub that can be trained up eventually into a tree. Loves the sun, loves the heat. The flowers are edible. They're very sweet. The white fleshy petals, not the red stamens, but the white petals, very sweet, very, very tasty, edible. And then it produces a fruit, an egg-shaped fruit that has very tasty pulp. So you can eat the flowers and the fruit of this tree. And it's very durable, very tough. And yes, planting 2 plants is a good idea for pollination. You get more fruiting from it. Tolerates the drought, but can take occasional watering. Variety they call Coolidge and Asmints are grown for the fruiting. Here's hollies. They're not used as much anymore. These are a plant that would take morning sun, but perhaps some shade in the afternoon. Some have thorns, most have berries. They prefer an acid type fertilizer and the acidic type soils. And lantana, I think everybody has lantana in their yard, all different varieties, all different colors. They love the sun and love the heat. They don't like water and they don't like fertilizer. Feeding them will prevent flowering. They will flower almost all year round. They take the heat and the sun. There's different varieties. Some spread along the ground. Some are more upright. They do produce a little berry at the end of the season. And but boy, you talk about a beautiful plant for hot, sunny areas that will bloom constantly. That would be it. And finally, we get to the wax leaf privet. Very common plant, great hedge, very durable, sometimes pruned into different shapes and sizes. Produces a white flower that may or may not be of any significance, other than the fact that it does have an odor that some people like and some don't. They will also produce a small berry afterwards, but this plant is one of the better hedge plants. There are 2 major varieties. The Japanese variety will be taller. So if you wanted a tall hedge, 8 to 10 feet, the Japanese variety would be the variety. The Texas variety, is a smaller one. It's called the wax leaf privet instead of the Japanese privet. This one's typically 4 to 6 feet high. Evergreen, takes any type of soil, varying water regimes, but we're finding that they don't like to be watered much more than about once a week. They can be prone to root rot. So here, there are some variegated varieties now. We'll talk a little bit about this plant here, the saucer magnolia. We talked about the tree variety magnolia a while back. This is a shrub type. It's deciduous. It drops its leaves in the winter And then before the new leaves come on, it produces huge, usually pink, rose-colored, or white flowers. In the heat of summer, late summer, the leaves will tend to burn a little bit, but they do have very attractive leaves. Best planted in half shade, half sun, or as an understory. In other words, under large trees. Consistent water with good drainage and occasional application of potassium. And there's a picture of the flower. The burgundy is a deep burgundy flower fading to pink at the tips. Very pretty. Chinese holly. This is another plant that does well underneath other things. In this case, it's growing underneath the roof line of a house where it will get some protection. It's upright. The leaves are pointy, not very friendly. Prefers half shade, regular water. Does grow straight up and down, so it's good for the background or a screen. The deer don't eat it, and it is fire resistant. The Myrtus communis, not used quite as much anymore as a hedge, but that's what it would be, is a hedge plant. Fragrant white flowers in the spring, and a little fruit afterwards. Grows well in a container, can be shaped, has to have well-drained soil, so it does not like wet, heavy soils. It does not like to be watered too terribly much. And there's some of the flowers. And the compact seems to be the more popular one because it is tighter, more compact. Still will give you the flowering though. Okay, Andina domestica. You've probably seen this plant. It's called heavenly bamboo. It does resemble bamboo, but it is not related. It is not aggressive like bamboo. It does have some interesting characteristics, including the foliage, which will change colors from bronze and red to yellow and green. Tends to prefer mostly sunlight, but can tolerate some shade. Shouldn't be pruned like a regular plant. Here's some of the red foliage and the pointed leaves. Does produce a flower that is fragrant, and then a berry that is attractive for the birds. There's a picture of the berries. There are dozens of different varieties. Some that'll get 6 feet tall, some that'll get a foot tall. But all of them giving you the same type of leaf, flower, and fruit. There's an interesting plant that we don't see quite as much, is the osmanthus. This shrub has one of the most pleasing fragrances in all of nature. The flowers are small, but they smell like an apricot. Very pretty plant. They bloom in the spring and summer. It's a hedge, probably best with no late afternoon sun. Can be used as an accent plant to put it by the front door just so you can enjoy that fragrance. There's a close-up of the flower. And that's what it's grown for, is that flower and the fragrance thereof. A Photinia, here's an evergreen shrub. And its claim to fame is that its new growth comes out deep burgundy red in early spring. Also produces a flower. We'll get you a close up. There you go. There's that red foliage in the spring. It loves full sun, does not want any shade whatsoever. Has to have good drainage. We've seen that it does better with a deep but infrequent watering. I've seen them as small trees, but they're mostly good as a tall hedge. And there's a picture of that foliage. Very beautiful plant. Next, the mock orange. This one here is the Wheeler's dwarf, which is the small one, maybe 3 feet high, 4 or 5 feet across. White flowers, evergreen. Some pruning will keep it in shape, but most people find that if they have the good spot for it, they never have to bother with it at all. Doesn't need much watering. In fact, if overwatered, it can do rather poorly, and it is fire resistant. Now, there are different varieties of mock orange, some which will get taller. And then the cream de mint there, which is a dwarf variety, very small. So the mock orange is a pretty big family, from upright to very low. Here's another big family, the Podocarpus family. A very desirable plant because of its upright growth and the fact that it does not have an invasive root system. So this plant can be planted in areas that would be smaller than you would plant most trees in. There are different varieties. The Hinkeli is one of the slower growing, longer leafed varieties. The Hinkeli variety, I have seen it tolerate some shade, actually. And some of the other varieties like the Gracillior, the Microphylla, etc., they don't need that shade that the Hinkeli might prefer. The Gracillior can grow into a tree. That's one of the bigger varieties. The Macrophylla is upright and fairly narrow. And the new Icy Blue, this is a new variety, has blue foliage, very pretty plant, and gaining popularity rapidly. Pyracanthus, you've seen these. They're not planted too much anymore, and the main reason is because of the thorns. The fruit is nice, the birds like it, and it is a tough plant. Thrives on neglect and abuse. Takes any type of soil, any type of temperature. In fact, you don't want to water it, and you don't want to feed it. If you have a need for this plant, you plant it and walk away. There are many varieties. The Victory is one of the taller ones. Once again, remember they do have thorns. Keep that in mind. The Santa Cruz is a small one. Not very tall, but can get quite wide. And now we get to the Rhaphiolippus. This is a very common plant. I think most people have these in their yard. Durable. Once again, many varieties, from as small as 3 to 4 feet to as tall as 6 feet. Most of them bloom with pink flowers, but there are some varieties that will bloom with white or red. Pruning after the bloom is the best time to do it. Takes full sun and will tolerate a little bit of shade. Half a day shade is fine for them. And soils are not fussy. Widely used accent plant. Lower varieties used for ground covers. Will tolerate shearing, though you will get reduced blooms if you prune too much or at the wrong time. The Pink Lady, probably the most popular one, with its deep pink flowers, and Clara has white, and Enchantress has pink with a more compact growth. And now the Umbellata minor. This one is used once again as a median shrub. So they're planting it out in the medians because it seems to be able to take the weather, the heat, etc. Quite well, and does not get very tall, 3 feet probably. Rosemary, very popular plant. I think this is a plant that most people are familiar with. The leaves are edible. This is the rosemary that you cook with. There are different varieties. Some grow upright, some drape, like you see in the slide here. Mostly blue flowers, takes the heat and sun better than just about any plant, any type of soil, low water requirement. And that's important because about the only way you're going to kill this plant is by overwatering it. The can be used for different things, but ground cover seems to be its main claim to fame because there are varieties that will grow quite a bit wider than they will high, have a good root system to hold the soil in place, and the deer and rabbits don't like it, and it's fire resistant. So excellent plant. This is a plant that everybody should have in their yard, one variety or another. And there are many varieties. Some that grow upright, some that grow right along the ground. And star jasmine, I think everybody's familiar with this plant. Will do almost anything you want it to do. This will grow as a ground cover, or you can train it up a support and it'll grow as tall as you'd like. We know that it's got the beautiful flowers and thus the name jasmine, although in fact it's truly not in the jasmine family, but you can grow it almost anywhere. Here it is growing as a ground cover. And of course, it smells very attractive. Can take the temperature extremes that we are known to get out here. Yeah, just a wonderful plant. And there are some varieties like the Asian jasmine that will grow quite low onto the ground. And some of the new variegated varieties have white leaves. We get to viburnum. Now, viburnum is a big family, and the tinus seems to be one of the more versatile ones. Nice hedge, particularly if you have a situation where you don't have complete sun all day, or you don't have complete shade all day. If you have one of those interim areas, a viburnum will fill that area just fine. If it's in deep shade, it will get mildew, or near the coast, it will get mildew. But if you can give it half and half, it will perform just fine. The spring bouquet is one of the more popular because it blooms for a longer period of time with this white flower that they get. So not a bad plant for those areas that are neither full sun nor full shade. Westringia, this is the Australian rosemary, almost always bushier than regular rosemary. And I have seen it up to 6 feet tall. In fact, after just a few years, I've seen it that tall. The foliage is gray, and the blooms are white. It likes well-drained soil and very little water. Another one of those Australian natives. We don't see it that much anymore because so many people are planting the regular rosemary. And there you can see its flowers, which are attractive, and the plant is just as durable as anything. So not a bad choice. Then we get to xylosma. This plant is another one that can be used for a myriad of things. On slopes, it has a wonderful root system and holds the soil together. It can take full sun all day long, or it can grow underneath trees. And it itself can eventually become tree-like with trimming. Yes, make sure you get a thornless variety. Xylosma has been known to produce thorns. And a very reliable plant, like I said. Full sun to tolerate shade. And here it is planted where it's sheared up to look almost tree-like. Okay, and that is the end of the slide presentation. I believe we will now go into the questions and answers. And Laura, are you going to guide us through that?
Yes, John. There is a question about your thoughts on the liquid amar.
Liquid amber tree.
Yes.
Yes. The liquid amber tree was just recently removed from our slide presentation. In fact, if you watched this presentation a couple of years back, it was in it. It's not in it anymore. And if you have a liquid amber, you probably know why. There is a new disease in Southern California, and it's very widespread here in Santa Clarita, that attacks the liquid ambers, and it kills them from the top down. And we can't do anything about the disease. So as you drive around town and you see liquid ambers, look up at the tops. Well, maybe you shouldn't do it while you're driving. Pull over and park, and you will find dieback in the tops of the trees. And this is being spread by an insect. Now, the insect we can control, but the disease we can't. So some people that have young liquid ambers are treating the trees every year for insects in the hopes that they can control the insect before it spreads the disease to their trees. Okay.
That was our, we have one more question. Okay. Any trees not covered in the presentation that you would recommend using?
Well, some of the trees that we went through in here are really good trees. They're excellent trees. I would suggest that you'll look up the Desert Museum Palo Verde and read about it. You'll find that's as good a tree as there is. The redbuds. I myself have several varieties of redbuds. I have the Oklahoma redbud, and it has the deepest wine red flowers. I have the Eastern redbud, dark pink flowers, and the native redbud I also have, and that is a shrubby one with pink flowers. So the redbuds, the whole family is just fantastic. If you have an area that you want a nice small tree and maybe it's next to the house or in a courtyard, the forest pansy redbud might be the prettiest tree in nature. So once again, look that up. And then we did talk about the arbutus. And I mentioned that the arbutus marina is tree-like. And the regular arbutus, that the arbutus unida, is a wonderful shrub. And it's relatively slow growing, takes the sun and the heat, and has a beautiful reddish trunk. So those are three plants, three trees and shrubs that I think everybody should consider. Now, for just plain shrubs, we do a presentation, another presentation, where we talk about shrubs and perennials. But I think the three best that people might have really good success with would be the rosemary, lavender, and sages. So I would pick the three trees that I mentioned and the three shrubs that I mentioned as plants that I would put at the top of any list. Okay.
Okay. Another question. The Jacaranda trees grow in our neighbor's town of Fillmore, but my local nursery did not recommend them here for SCV. Any particular reason?
Yes, the jacarandas are subject to cold damage. So you'll find them all the way from the coast, clear into, yes, into Fillmore, and I see some in the San Fernando Valley. We are just a little bit different climate zone. I know we're only 20 miles from, say, Val Verde or Piru, and the jacaranda can grow there. But the success rate out here is minimal because they are subject to frost damage. While it's true, we are getting warmer every year, every single year, we're getting warmer, and we're getting fewer freezes and fewer nights of frost. The jacaranda still is not a good selection for here because of its susceptibility to frost damage.
Okay, and there's a follow-up question. Are there any problem trees or shrubs not covered in your presentation?
Yes, and the reason they're not covered is because there are problems. Yes, yes. In fact, I've done whole presentations on trees not to plant. So when we talk about trees, we prefer to talk about ones that maybe you should plant. That's why when we mention the ash, the only one that we suggest planting is the raywood, and avoid all the others. I mentioned to avoid the eucalyptus. I mentioned to avoid the pepper trees. So avoid cottonwoods, avoid the weeping willows. Yes, there are dozens of trees that should be avoided, and great care and concern should be used before planting any tree. Look it up, research any tree before you plant it. Okay.
Okay. I think that's okay. So there's a question about downloading the PowerPoint. If you would like to have a copy of it, please email me, lgallegos, and that's LGALLEGOS at scvwa.org, and I can send you a copy of that, and I'll drop it in the chat right now.
Yeah, that's a wonderful idea, folks. Download the presentation. That way you'll have these slides, you'll have the colored pictures to refresh your memory. There's some good information on these slides. So yes, I'd strongly suggest downloading them.
This is Kathy here. I know some of you have gone to our classes in the past, and GoToWebinar let us put the presentation in the webinar where you could download it, but Zoom doesn't give us that option for attachment. So we have the new process where you just email us and we will be glad to send it to you.
And that email address is that something that they can find readily?
Yeah, I went ahead and I dropped it in the chat. So hopefully whoever is looking for that, just send me an email and I'll send over a copy.
Excellent.
I don't see any more questions. So that wraps up our questions and answer. People are thanking you, John. And I would like to thank you as well. And I would love to invite everybody to our next gardening class in January on the 22nd from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. And the topic will be proper pruning. So we'd love to have you join us. Thank you everyone for your time today.
Laura, if I may interrupt, will that be a hands-on class or is that going to be online again?
It will be virtual. All of our classes for 2022 will still be virtual.
Okay.
Okay.
For 2022. Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Keepers coming up. Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. Have a lovely Saturday, and thank you for joining us today.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Kathy.